Contract marriage with the Mad Duke of the North. They promised not to fall in love. The northern winds carried whispers of blood. To the nobles in gilded halls, the Duke of the North was no man at all but a legend carved from iron and cruelty. They called him the Bloodthirsty Wolf, a commander who had bathed the snowfields in red, who never smiled except before battle, who was as cold as the land he ruled. Suitors fled at the mere suggestion of his name. Daughters wept when their fathers joked of such a match. A man like that was not a husband, he was a sentence. And yet in the candle-lit chambers of House Ellengrad, one young woman whispered the unthinkable. "I will marry him." Her father's goblet paused mid-air. Her mother gasped, while her sisters laughed as though they had heard the finest jest of the season. "You?" one sneered. The Duke of the North would sooner wed a ghost than a dark-haired girl with mud-brown eyes. She did not flinch. She had lived her whole life beneath their scorn. In House Ellengrad, beauty was measured like coin, golden hair, eyes of ice blue, skin untouched by the sun. Her sisters were treasures in that currency. She was a flaw in the portrait. Servants whispered it, her family repeated it. Not one of us. And so she learned to bow her head, to bite her tongue, to survive in silence. Until now. Because she knew something her family never cared to see. A woman without value in her own house could still have value in another. The Duke of the North needed a wife. Not for love, not for warmth, but for power. By law, he could not claim full command of his estates, his armies, his fortune, until he wed. And no one, no princess, no lady, no baron's daughter, would dare bind themselves to him. No one except her. She had read the contracts. She had studied the rules. Marriage could be a bargain as much as a bond. And if this duke truly desired only a signature, then she would give him one. In return, he would give her the one thing her own bloodline never had: protection. And so she wrote the terms with her own hand, steady and bold. A marriage not of hearts, but of ink and ink alone. 2 clauses stood above the rest. They must never fall in love. And after 3 years, the bond would dissolve, leaving them free. It was simple. It was cold. It was salvation. Her family mocked her still. "Do you think he will even answer your letter? Do you think he will even spare you a glance?" She only smiled, though her heart pounded. "Then I will go to him myself. If the world calls him a monster, let me see his face before I believe it." And so, in the dead of winter, a single carriage rolled north through snow-laden forests. Within it sat the Count's unwanted daughter, clutching a contract like a torch in the dark. She had no crown, no favor, no father's blessing. She had only her resolve. Beyond the mountains, a fortress rose from the white horizon, black against the storm. Smoke curled from its towers like the breath of some ancient beast. There, the bloodthirsty duke awaited, and when their eyes met for the first time, the world would never be the same. Snow lashed against the carriage as it climbed the frozen hills, and when the wheels finally ground to a halt, the fortress of the north loomed above like a beast crouched against the storm. Black stone walls scarred by centuries of war towered over her, their banners snapping like whips in the wind. The guards who opened the gates did not smile. No one smiled here. Inside, the halls were colder still. Flames struggled in the hearths, their light devoured by the weight of stone. Servants bowed stiffly but did not speak. The silence of the place seemed to press on her shoulders, heavy and watchful. And then he entered, the Duke of the North. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered, his dark cloak lined with wolf fur, his gaze as sharp as the steel at his hip. Scars crossed the lines of his jaw, pale against skin weathered by war. His eyes were not wild as the stories claimed, but piercing, cold as glaciers. He looked at her as though weighing her soul on a scale. "So," he said at last, his voice low, edged with iron. "The daughter of Ellengrad comes crawling north." Her sister's laughter rang in her memory. "He would never look at you." But he was looking now. And though her knees threatened to weaken, she did not bow. "I did not crawl, Your Grace," she answered. "I came with a contract." A flicker passed through his gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or amusement, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He extended his hand, and she placed the parchment into it. His gloves were cold against her fingers. He read in silence. His brow arched once when he reached the clause forbidding love. A muscle in his jaw tightened when he reached the promise of divorce. Then slowly, he lowered the parchment. No love. 3 years. Freedom. You insult me, he said, though his voice remained steady. You need a wife to hold your title, she replied, her voice firm though her heart hammered. I need a protector to escape my family. This is not an insult, Your Grace. It is a bargain, a contract that gives us both what we lack. The hall seemed to hold its breath, and then, after a long silence, the Duke laughed. Not the mad cackle of tavern rumors, but a dry, sharp sound like stone cracking under frost. Very well, he said. A contract it will be. But know this, you enter a house of wolves. If you bleed, do not expect mercy. She lifted her chin. Then I shall not bleed. The wedding was swift and joyless. No music played, no feast was laid. The vows were spoken before the cold altar of the northern chapel, the snow outside falling like silent witnesses. She became his duchess not in silks and roses, but in iron and frost. The whispers began at once. Servants murmured that she was a fool. Nobles scoffed that she was desperate. Letters from her family dripped with venom. You shame us further. To wed a beast? To tie our name to madness? She burned them in the fire. The Duke, true to his word, kept his distance. He spoke little, ate little, and when he did appear in the halls, it was like a shadow passing through flame. Yet in that silence, she began to see things others had missed. She saw the way he stood at the ramparts long after the guard had changed, watching the borders as though haunted by them. She saw the scars on his hands, too many to count, some old, some new. She noticed how the servants did not cower in fear of beatings, but in reverence of discipline. This was not a house ruled by cruelty, but by severity. One night, when the winds howled so loud the walls seemed to tremble, she found him in the great hall alone, a map unrolled before him. Candles flickered over the lines of rivers and mountains, dotted with red ink. You study war even in peace? She asked. He did not look up. Peace does not last. And do you never tire of being the monster they name you? That made him lift his gaze. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw not the wolf but the man beneath. There was no madness in him, only weariness, only the burden of battles fought too long. I learned long ago, he said quietly, that it matters little what I am. Men prefer their monsters, and so I became one. Her heart shifted in that moment, not in love, not yet, but in understanding. The days passed, cold and silent, yet slowly, the silence began to change. He permitted her to sit with him in council, though he never asked her opinion. He let her walk the battlements, though guards once forbidden now bowed. When she tripped on the ice, his hand steadied her before he stepped back as though burned. They were strangers bound by ink, yet each day the ink thinned and something else began to write itself in its place. Still, neither spoke it, neither dared, for the contract loomed above them like a blade. And so, in the Duke's cold fortress, amid whispers of scandal and shadows of war, a dangerous truth began to stir, that a bargain struck in desperation was becoming something neither could control. Winter loosened its grip, but the north never softened. The sun returned only to glance off ice and leave the cold unharmed. In that pale light, the Duke's riders found tracks along the ridge. Boot prints too neat to be hunters, iron studs too disciplined to be thieves. When the scouts returned with a torn pennant, black on crimson, the Duke's jaw tightened as if the wind itself had bitten him. Border raiders testing the spine of his land. Rumor would name it his hunger for war. The truth was simpler. War kept finding him. He summoned his captains in the long hall. Men stood like pillars in furs and mail, voices low, eyes wary. She entered without invitation, her steps soundless on the rushes, and took a place near the hearth as if warmth itself were a form of courage. No one told her to leave. Perhaps they had learned that this duchess, born from disdain, wore silence like armor. Maps unfurled again, a river like a dark vein, a pass like a wound that never closed. The Duke spoke in clipped commands, not rhetoric. He valued movement over noise. When a captain suggested burning the hamlet near the pass to deny cover, her voice cut across the table before she knew it belonged to her. Burn a roof and you make an enemy. Patch a roof and you make a wall. Heads turned. The captain bristled. The Duke's gaze held steady. If we move the villagers to the inner farms, she continued, heart pounding, we deny the raiders their shadows and gain hands to mend our own. The hall waited for the Duke to dismiss her. He did not. Send word to the hamlet, he said at last. Bring them in. We will be a wall. Days later, she rode with him, cloaked against needles of wind that found every seam. He didn't protest. He didn't need to. The land argued enough. Valleys full of blue shadow, ravens stitching black against the sky, pines whispering rumors no court had patience to hear. They reached the hamlet at dusk, roofs thin as eyelids, smoke thin as prayer. Men looked up with suspicion. Women looked up with hope they tried to hide. She dismounted, sank to her knees in the mud beside a child's broken sled, and set her hands to the runner with the quiet competence of someone who has done smaller, harder things under crueler eyes. The runner held. The child grinned through chapped lips. It was a small repair, nothing to a ledger. A ledger does not know the taste of relief. Faces softened. When the Duke gave the order to move by morning, they moved. The raid came sooner than the ravens promised. Steel rang thin in the frozen air, a sound like bells angry at the sky. She watched from the inner wall because he ordered it, because command was a habit that protected her even as it chafed. The Duke fought without flourish, a grim and ugly economy that left no joy for the poets. He was a wall that moved and a blade that remembered. When an axeman fainted low to drag a captain from the saddle, the Duke crossed the distance like a storm crossing a field and broke the man with a single, merciless cut. She did not cheer. She understood then why the North called him monster, not because he loved blood, but because he did not waste it. After, in the stillness that follows the wrong kind of music, she found him binding his own forearm in the shadow of a buttress. Blood had darkened his sleeve to wine. I told you, he said without looking up, not to come down from the wall. She knelt and took the linen from his hands without asking. And I told you, she said, steadying his arm, that I do not bleed. He huffed something that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so close to a wince. She cleaned the wound, hands sure from years of stitching hems that split at the worst possible moments. The cut was deep, not cruel. He watched her fingers, not the pain. Why did you come to the North? He asked, not as a test, but as a man who wanted one clean answer in a world full of dirty ones. Because no one here pretends warmth, she said. They give you fire, or they give you nothing. I can live with both. The binding held. He flexed his hand and nodded once as if she were a captain who had passed inspection. Spring reached other lands. The North traded white for gray. The fortress filled with noises that were not war. A blacksmith's temper singing the edge into plowshares. Women laughing like bells with oil on their hands. A stable boy whispering to a mare who had decided foaling was an act of sovereignty. She found a place in that noise. In council, she said little and listened much. Beyond it, she learned every name that held the roof up. She mended not just sleeves, but systems. A storeroom ledger that miscounted hunger on purpose. A tax agent whose greed had teeth. A guard rota that left the eastern tower blind for an hour no one had thought to measure. She brought order without banners. Rumor reached the southern courts that the monster's bride had turned his keep into a monastery. The rumor ran ahead of the truth as usual. The truth took longer, but it arrived. The Duke's family, those who wore his blood like a right to speak, visited when the passes thawed. Uncles with money and memories long enough to remember when young men knew their place. Aunties with advice braided into their hair like knives disguised as ribbons. Cousins who had never seen war but had seen mirrors until they forgot other faces existed. They called the contract practical, which is what cowards call love when they fear it will cost them coin. They measured her with pale eyes and found her wanting in the currencies they knew. the angle of a bow, the history of a wine, the knack of flattering a man foolish enough to believe that compliment is currency. The house needs heirs, one aunt murmured over tea, meaning bed, body, belly, duty. The contract, like a ghost at table, laid its cold hands on her shoulders and his. "We have 3 years," the Duke said lightly, by which he meant, "The law cannot make a heart move 1 inch, and I refuse to push it by force." The aunt pursed her mouth into a rose that had forgotten its scent. It should have remained cold. It did not. Coolness is a stance, not a season. On the night of the midwinter festival, when even the north lights its fear on purpose to make it look like celebration, the fortress opened its gates to the villages. Torches braided with evergreen lined the yard. Men who had bled together laughed like boys who had not yet learned what bleeding means. She baked bread with the women until her wrists ached, and then carried a basket through the hall, offering a crust here, a sweet there, a story for a child who had never touched velvet and thought it would feel like summer water. The Duke watched from the dais, a glass untasted in his hand, a smile so small it might have been a trick of the light, when a drunken minor lord, as soft as unrisen dough and twice as useless, slurred that the Duchess of the North had hands like a scullery maid. The hall stilled to a knife's edge. The Duke moved like winter moves across a window. Quiet. Total. "A scullery maid keeps men like you from starving," he said. Not loud, but wide enough for the walls to carry it back. The Lord flushed purple. No one laughed. She set the bread on the table before the Duke, a gesture that looked small and was not. He did not thank her. Gratitude would have made it about him. Instead, he tore the crust and shared it with the nearest child, and the hall remembered how to breathe. Jealousy arrived pretending to be etiquette. A lady from the southern courts, blonde as law, perfect as opinion, visited with a retinue that smelled like citrus and calculation. She had once been considered for the Duke, rumor said, before he learned the difference between a knife and a needle. She smiled at the Duchess as one smiles at a stray that insists on staying, and spent an afternoon alone with the Duke in his solar discussing treaties that had not yet been translated. When the lady left, she forgot to forget a handkerchief on his desk, embroidered with a crest that shouted even when folded. The Duchess placed it in a drawer that ate such gifts, and said nothing. That night, as snow restored the world to modesty, the Duke stood too long at the window and the Duchess slept too lightly. The next day, the handkerchief was gone, and the lady's retinue rode south with cheeks chapped red in a way that suggested the wind had not been the only cold they met. They did not speak of wanting. Desire lived in the hinges of things, in the turn of his head when she laughed at something foolish and true, in the way her hand found the back of a chair where he would soon sit, in the silence they made together that was not absence, but agreement. The contract took shape as a third presence, a god that demanded abstinence and offered sanctuary in return. They honored it because they were honorable. They feared it because they were human. Danger found the crack honor leaves. Word reached them of a plot, not against the Duke, who knew plots like men know sleep, but against her. Her family had sent north a cousin with a false smile and an old grievance. The girl who was not blonde had shamed them by rising higher than her color deserved. He arrived with a crate of gifts from Ellengrad, satin and sweetmeats, and a book of prayers whose margins had once taught the Duchess to hide her mind in holy words. She accepted the gifts and refused the company. That night, the cousin bribed a stable hand whose need was greater than his caution. A wheel pin was loosened on the Duchess's carriage. The road south toward the river pass would provide the rest. The morning was white and honest. She rode out, not toward the pass, but toward the hill above the old watchpost, a habit she had learned, to see the land before it tried to see her. The wheel failed where the saboteur intended it not to, on a flat stretch, in full view of the ramparts. The carriage listed, the horse screamed, and for a narrow second the world considered letting her die for the sake of a man's pride. She climbed free, calm because panic is a luxury poor girls are punished for, and turned the horse's head until the animal found ground. The gate bell tolled. Men ran. The Duke arrived not in a storybook fury, but with the same economy he brought to battle. 2 orders, 4 hands where there had been none, a blade through the broken pin to lever it out. He did not touch her. He looked once at her hands, clean and steady, and then at the cousin whose face had discovered a new urgent meaning for the word pale. "Accidents happen," the cousin began. "Not twice," the Duke said. "And not here." The cousin left before lunch and did not stop until spring. Word rode south faster than he did. When fear fails, slander tries again. Letters came from Ellengrad, phrases tasting of ice and acid. "You are wasting yourself with a beast. 3 years will not wash your shame. He will never love you." She burned them all but one. That one she folded, tucked into the seam of her bodice, and wore like a splinter you choose not to pull to remember how the flesh heals around it. That night she found the Duke in the armory, his hands black with oil, repairing a sword whose stories none of the new men knew. "Do you ever tire," she asked, "of being told what you are?" He did not look up. "Only when those telling me begin to believe themselves." She laid the letter on the bench between them without a word. He read it. He did not ask permission to burn it. He handed it back. "They do not know the North," he said. "They do not know you." The words should have been simple. They were not. They were an oath spoken without altar. The summer brought a strange, brief gentleness, wildflowers that dared color, a river that laughed too loud for a land that liked quiet. In that borrowed season, the Duke took her to the high meadow where the wind tastes of iron and forgiveness. "I was 12, he said, surprising himself with the confession. "When my father told me men will always need someone to fear, I thought he meant enemies. He meant me." She found his hand without thinking, not to comfort a child, but to anchor a man. "Then let them fear your justice," she said. "Let them learn it is more terrible than their lies." He held her hand for one heartbeat longer than the contract would bless, then let go as if the letting go could undo the truth of that second. It could not. The deeper trials arrived without banners, a famine year in the eastern farms where frost returned like an old debt. A dispute with a minor lord who believed taxes are suggestions and oaths are poems. A fever in the barracks that had learned to fear nothing and forgot to fear the small. She moved among these troubles with sleeves rolled and jaw set, drilling holes in barrels to measure grain honestly, reading old charters aloud to men who had never heard the law sound like it included them, boiling water until the fever's pride broke into sweat. The Duke watched and learned he was not the only wall in his house. When a captain muttered that a duchess should not stand in smoke with soldiers, the Duke's answer came without heat. "A house that keeps its women in glass," he said, "shatters at the first stone." And yet, through all this closeness, the contract held them apart like a pane of winter glass, holding in breath and holding out warmth. He came to her door once, only once, on a night when thunder tried to be mountains and failed. He had a report in his hand, and a question on his mouth, and the peculiar expression of a man who has run out of rooms to pace in. She opened before he knocked. For a foolish instant, both forgot which of them had reached for the latch. He set the report down as if it were why he had come and asked about taxes, as if taxes were more urgent than the lightning counting the seconds between thought and speech. She answered because answering was safer than burning. When he left, the corridor seemed to exhale. Her candle guttered and steadied. In the morning they were formal again. It fooled no one who had learned to read the temperature of rooms. The accident that would break the contract began as justice. A convoy headed to the border carried grain too dear to fail, and a magistrate too proud to listen to advice. The Duke rode with them because men obey the law when the law carries a sword. The Duchess rode because she had promised the eastern farms that the bread would arrive, and promises mean more when made in person. At the throat of the pass, where the mountain tries to remember being a sea and only remembers teeth, a rockslide bared its teeth first. The first boulders fell like arguments, the next fell like verdicts. Horses screamed. The magistrate prayed to a god he had forgotten how to name. The Duke shouted orders that turned chaos into a line that might live. She dismounted, put her shoulder to a wheel with two men who had never touched a lady's sleeve and were too afraid to marvel, and pushed until heat claimed her breath in a land that never warms. A second fall came. She heard it before she knew what to call it. the specific, terrible sound of stone deciding to change its mind about where it lives. The Duke saw the shadow reach for her and moved before his name fit in her mouth. They fell together, not under rock but under the edge of it, a curtain of shattered shale that clawed instead of crushed. The world dimmed to dust. For a terrible heartbeat, there was no breath to count, no cry to measure, only the knowledge that if one of them did not breathe, the other would learn the shape grief makes when it finally decides it is done with hiding. He found her shoulder beneath grit, her hair full of the earth's old stories, her pulse stubborn as a northern drum. She found his hand by anger first and love second, because anger is quicker and love is stronger. Men dug, lines held. When the dust settled, the pass still had a road and the convoy still had a chance and the north still had its wall. She woke in the fortress with a bruise that would teach color new shades and a bandage that smelled faintly of him. He sat beside the bed, unshaved, unarmored, refusing to pretend that he had slept. For a long time they said nothing, because nothing is sometimes the most honest tongue. Then he failed the contract first. "If the stones had taken you," he said, voice scraped raw, "there would be no law to keep me from burning the mountain to ash with my hands." It was not poetry, it was confession. The room heard it. The night heard it. The promise they had made to ink heard it, and tore a small, necessary seam. She failed it second. "If you had not reached me," she answered, fingers finding his wrist where the old wound had learned to be a scar, "I would have taught the earth your name until it gave you back." There are sentences that once spoken cannot be hidden again in closets labeled practical. This was one. He bowed his head as if to a god who had finally introduced himself properly. She leaned forward because gravity is sometimes a choice. Their foreheads touched, the smallest disobedience, the largest truth. And in that hush they knew what the contract had tried to protect them from and what it had almost cost them. A love born not of hunger, but of recognition, not of rescue, but of partnership. They did not break the last boundary that night. The North is patient with weather and with vows. Instead, they rewrote the contract in the only ink that matters. They began to live as if its spirit had always meant this. He ate where she ate, not because the hall required it, but because food tastes most like bread when shared. She walked the ramparts with him, not behind, not beside, but with. When the aunt returned with her knives disguised as ribbons, she found them both sharpening steel with the same easy silence and left with the unhelpful feeling that perhaps monsters can be husbands and girls with mud-brown eyes can be queens without crowns. The whispers changed timbre. Southern court still called him mad. The North called him ours. Ellengrad still called her shame. The fortress called her duchess, and meant the word as if it had been waiting for a mouth brave enough to say it properly. They did not announce anything. They did not need to. Every repaired wheel, every convoy that arrived, every roof patched against the next storm, every soldier shaved without blood, every child who learned their letters in a hall that once only learned war, all of it added up to a sentence the world could read without requiring calligraphy. Love had violated the clause and redeemed the vow. They had promised not to fall. They had fallen standing. The contract lay locked away in a chest of iron, forgotten beneath dust and time. Its ink had been sharp, its rules merciless. No love, 3 years, freedom. And yet the paper had been outlived by the fire it never counted on. What they had built was not a bargain. It was a kingdom of two hearts that had refused to be caged by fear. In the halls of the North, the Duke no longer walked alone. At his side was a duchess who had come to him for protection, but had given him something he had never known: peace. Their days were no longer counted by clauses, but by victories won together, by winters survived as partners, by small, ordinary moments that tasted sweeter than any feast of kings. The world still called him monster. Some would always prefer their legends to the truth. But in the quiet of his keep, in the strength of her gaze, he was no monster at all. He was a man, and he was hers. And so, the tale that began with ink and ice ended with fire and devotion. A contract dissolved, a love discovered, a future rewritten. Because sometimes the greatest vows are not the ones written in parchment, but the ones carved silently, stubbornly, into the soul. And tell me, if you had sworn never to fall in love, yet found a heart that made you feel alive for the first time. Would you keep the vow? Or would you break the contract as they did for love?